Welcome to the video about the organisms that fall into kingdom Protista. So our protists are eukaryotic organisms. Most of them are going to be unicellular, and they're kind of the oddball out organisms. When classifying organisms, right, the animals fell neatly into one category, plants into another, fungi into another, so on and so forth. But the protists are kind of these organisms that didn't neatly, perfectly fit into any of those categories. So you're going to hear me say that some of the protists are animal-like or plant-like because they have certain features or characteristics that resemble animals or plants or whatever, but they don't have all the qualifications in order to have been classified into that respective kingdom. So the protists do live in water. That is a unifying feature. And a lot of them are going to be parasites, at least the ones that we're going to talk about. And we're going to split kingdom Protista into two groups, the protozoans, which are animal-like organisms, and the algae, which are more plant-like organisms. So what you're going to notice is you need to know, well, you're going to notice the classification scheme, and you also need to know the classification. Okay, it was a little bit easier with the fungi. Now, as you can see, there's a lot more groups. So depending on how you learn, you may want to take a minute and sketch out a blank one of these or create it in Word and make sure that you can fill this out by memory before the exam. Because I could ask you, like here's our good friend Trypaena cruzi, where my cursor is, and I could ask you, what group does it belong to? And you could tell me the zooflagellates. Or maybe I'd want you to know that it's a protozoan. Or I could even just say, Trypanosoma cruzi belongs to which kingdom? And you would need to know that it's a protist. Okay, so you can easily see how I could do a select all type of question, right? Select all the organisms that are zooflagellates, or select all of the organisms that are from kingdom Protista. Okay, so you are going to need to know your classification. So remember, there's not as many signs and symptoms and virulence factors like with the other diseases, but what we are adding is classification. So give yourself plenty of time to be familiar with this. All right, let's go ahead. So we're going to start with the protozoans, and protozoa actually means first animal, but remember, they're not actually animals. They are animal-like cells, okay? And one big difference is going to be that they lack a cell wall. And well, that's not necessarily a huge difference, but they do lack a cell wall, and they are heterotrophic, right? They cannot make their own food. They have to get it from other sources. And as you can see here, they do feed on animal cells, bacteria, even other protozoans. And similar to the fungi, they do have forms of sexual and asexual reproduction. One form of asexual reproduction is something you're already familiar with. We talked about it with bacteria, which is binary fission. So essentially the cell just elongates, copies its DNA. So now it has two copies of DNA. So one copy goes to one end of the cell, the other copy goes to the other end of the cell, and it kind of pinches off in the middle, and it results in a daughter cell that is genetically identical to the parent, right? It's like a copy and paste mechanism. Another form of asexual reproduction is schizogony. And here's the definition up top, but essentially what's happening is if you look at this picture, the nucleus is replicated a lot initially, right? All these little purple circles, and then eventually cytokinesis happens. And cytokinesis is the term for the cytoplasm dividing. And so the cytoplasm will divide such that each new cell has a nucleus and a cytoplasm and can make everything that it needs. Okay, so both binary fission and schizogony are forms of asexual reproduction. So you might be asking, what's their form of sexual reproduction? And that is going to be conjugation. And so conjugation is going to occur when two protists that are of the same species are able to come together and they form a temporary union. As you can see here, they temporarily kind of fuse part of themselves together. The nucleus is going to break down, which is going to allow them to make copies of their nucleus and then they're going to actually exchange some of that genetic material while they're fused together. And then eventually the two protists separate, the nucleus reforms, and now they are actually both genetically different from what they started out to be. So it's pretty interesting there. They start off one way and they end up whole different organisms. Now they are still the same species, but you know what I mean. They've gotten some new DNA. So when it comes to the protozoans, they do have a pretty complex life cycle. They alternate between two forms. The trophozoite, which is this active motile stage. This is when they are inside of like us, the host, and they're acting as a parasite and causing disease. The other form is the cyst form, and I compare this to the endospore because the cysts are really, really resistant, and it's an inactive, kind of dormant phase. So what's interesting, if you were to look at this picture, these life cycles are kind of complex. The cyst form is what enters the human host. Once it's inside this safe, nutritious environment, it switches to the active trophozoite stage, right? It feeds on us and steals our nutrients. But then when it's on its way out, it's like, that outside environment, that's kind of harsh. It'll switch back to its cyst stage and when it leaves the body. Okay, and that allows it to survive for a while until it can eventually get to a new host. Now, sometimes the trophozoite stage does pass through the feces, but it cannot withstand the external environment. It's just too harsh. And so the trophozoites will die. Okay, so again, normally it's going to be the cyst stage that enters and exits the body, and the trophozoites only thrive when they're inside the human host. All right, so we're going to wrap up this video with just talking about how we classify the different protozoans. They are grouped into 4 distinct categories based on motility. Our sarcodines use pseudopods, which are essentially they look like fake feet. It's like they extend part of the cell. Kind of imagine when you're at the edge of a pool and you're like, oh, is it too cold? I don't know. And you stick your foot out and kind of touch the water to assess it. That's kind of what a pseudopod is. The cell kind of sticks a part of itself out, assesses the environment, and then either retracts or will go forward. So it's kind of like sticking a leg out. The zooflagellates, as you can see in the name, it has flagella in it. So their form or their appendage for motility is going to be flagella. The ciliates, as the name implies, use cilia, those little hair-like projections. And then the last category is actually pretty much immotile. And so we call those the sporozoans, but they are also referred to as apicomplexa. So go ahead and know both of those terms. All right, so the next video is going to start in on our sarcodines and possibly some of the zooflagellates.